Imagine you are 21 years old.
Right.
Your entire life, you have been groomed to rule this fabulously wealthy nation.
Right. The wealthiest of the region.
Exactly. But instead of sitting on a throne, you are currently, like, suffocating in the dark,
Yeah.
in the stifling heat of a coarse linen laundry sack.
Oh, it's a terrifying scenario.
Yeah, you are being physically hauled on the back of a servant through these hostile, heavily guarded streets of your own capital city. And, I mean, every time a guard stops your servant, your heart just stops.
Because if they check the cargo.
Right.
Yeah.
If a spear is thrust into that sack, your life ends immediately. And if you somehow survive that journey to the palace, the climax of your night involves being unrolled, covered in dust and sweat, at the feet of the most terrifying, battle-hardened dictator on the planet.
A man who could literally have you executed with just a wave of his hand.
Exactly. And that terrifying, hyper-calculated gamble is not some scene from a Hollywood thriller. That was the actual physical reality of a young woman who has been completely flattened by 2 millennia of myth. So today, we are doing a deep dive into the source material on the ultimate geopolitical strategist, Cleopatra.
And, the contrast between the cultural caricature of this woman and the historical reality is just staggering.
It really is.
For thousands of years, the narrative has been aggressively manipulated to portray her simply as a seductress.
Right.
Like a woman who utilized nothing but physical charm to bewitch powerful Roman men.
Yeah, just completely reducing her to this comic book villain origin story.
Exactly.
Oh.
But the documents and the historical consensus we are analyzing today, which are sourced originally from an advanced historical linguistics program, they paint a completely different picture. We are looking at a master polyglot, a formidable intellectual, and a naval commander.
I mean, the word seductress just strips her of all her agency. It is such a convenient way to explain away a female leader who routinely outmaneuvered the men trying to conquer her.
Oh, absolutely. Her life is really a rigorous study in high-stakes public relations and narrative control.
So that is our mission for this deep dive. We want to extract the underlying mechanisms of her reign. Like, how did her mind actually work? How did she navigate this geopolitical landscape where, a single misread alliance meant the total annihilation of her kingdom?
Well, to understand her strategic mind, we really have to examine the specific pressures of the environment that forged her. So we are starting in 69 BC, the year of her birth.
In Alexandria, Egypt.
Right. But classifying Alexandria merely as a city just fails to capture its weight. This was the Mediterranean crucible of human intellect.
Yeah, if you walk through Alexandria in 69 BC, you wouldn't just see a bustling port. You would see the ancient equivalent of, like, a modern tech mega hub mashed together with an Ivy League university.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Imagine the academic gravity of Oxford combined with the massive wealth and relentless innovation of Silicon Valley, just entirely concentrated on the North African coast. And all the absolute sharpest minds in astronomy and engineering and mathematics were drawn there.
Largely because of the Great Library.
Yes, the Great Library.
Which functioned as the intellectual engine of the ancient world. I mean, it wasn't just a static room full of dusty scrolls. It was an active, aggressively funded research institution.
The funding part is wild to me.
Oh, the ruling dynasty poured immense wealth into acquiring every known text. Ships docking in the harbor were legally required to surrender any books they had on board so they could be copied.
They literally confiscated your books.
They did. And growing up in the shadow of that relentless pursuit of knowledge, that fundamentally shaped Cleopatra's psychological baseline. But we have to talk about where the wealth that funded that library came from.
Right, the ruling family, which was structurally a massive geopolitical anomaly.
The Ptolemaic dynasty.
The source material emphasizes a distinction here that completely blew my mind when I first read it. Her lineage was Ptolemaic Greek. They were descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals.
Yes, Ptolemy the First.
And by the time Cleopatra was born, this family had ruled Egypt for 300 years, 3 centuries. Yet they remained entirely, fiercely distinct from the native Egyptians they were actually governing.
Yeah, they functioned less like native monarchs and much more like an occupying corporate board that actively refused to assimilate.
Wow, an occupying corporate board. That is so accurate.
For 3 centuries, they maintained this strict Macedonian Greek identity. They lived in a cordoned-off royal quarter in Alexandria. They worshipped a highly Hellenized pantheon of gods. And most crucially, they maintained a viciously insulated bloodline.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that insulated bloodline, because it explains so much about her survival instincts. The Ptolemies practiced sibling marriage.
They did.
Which, to a modern listener, The incest is obviously jarring, but the strategic logic behind it was entirely about consolidating absolute power, right?
Exactly. Think about it from their perspective. If a Ptolemaic king married a princess from a powerful local Egyptian family, or even a rival Greek aristocratic family, well, suddenly that family has a legitimate claim to the throne.
Right. They get a foot in the door.
Exactly. So by marrying siblings, they ensure the keys to the kingdom never left the immediate family tree.
But the unintended consequence of that strategy.
Oh, as a psychological pressure cooker.
Yeah, because when your brother is also your co-ruler and your potential husband, he is not a sibling in any traditional sense. He is your primary political rival.
Right. Every single person sitting at the family dinner table has a legitimate, blood-backed claim to the throne.
It turns the concept of sibling rivalry into literal blood sport. You aren't fighting over toys. You are fighting over a fabulously wealthy empire. Like if your sister gains too much favor with the military generals, you might not wake up the next morning.
And that is exactly the environment that forces a highly specific evolutionary adaptation. A child raised in that environment, where trust is quite literally a fatal vulnerability, must develop profound strategic paranoia just to survive to adulthood.
You have to be constantly scanning the room.
You learn to read microexpressions. You learn to trace the shifting loyalties of the court eunuchs, the military commanders, the royal tutors. Cleopatra was not simply educated. She was actively training for a lifelong, high-stakes intelligence war against her own blood relatives.
Which brings us to the actual curriculum of that training. She didn't just hide in her quarters hoping to avoid a poisoned cup of wine. She weaponized her access to the great library.
She was a voracious learner.
The texts detail how she immersed herself in mathematics, philosophy, and science. She was a trained debater.
And we have to remember that the philosophy and mathematics were not just abstract pursuits. In the ancient world, mathematics was deeply tied to logistics, architecture, and military engineering.
Right, it was practical.
Very. And philosophy was the bedrock of rhetoric and persuasive argument. So when she studied these disciplines, she was actually acquiring the practical tools necessary to govern a complex agrarian economy and, argue geopolitical strategy with seasoned diplomats.
Oh, okay, but wait, let's unpack this for a second. If this family had access to the greatest educational institution on Earth, how is it mathematically possible that for 300 years, not a single Ptolemaic ruler bothered to learn the native Egyptian language?
It is quite astonishing, isn't it?
I struggle to understand the logistics of that. Like, how does a dynasty govern millions of people, direct an agricultural system spanning the entire length of the Nile, and collect taxes for 3 centuries without ever speaking to their own subjects?
Well, it relied on a massive, highly stratified bureaucratic filter.
A filter.
Yeah, the Ptolemies established Greek as the exclusive language of administration. So if an Egyptian farmer had a dispute over, say, grain yields or property lines, it had to be translated up through layers of local scribes, right, to Greek-speaking regional governors and then eventually to the palace. It was an administration built entirely on military enforcement and institutional arrogance. The rulers viewed themselves as Greek overlords extracting wealth from a foreign territory, not as shepherds of a native populace.
But that arrogance seems like a massive structural vulnerability. I mean, you are entirely reliant on middle managers. If the Greek administrators decide to just lie to the king about how angry the populace is, the king has absolutely no way of knowing until a riot breaks out.
Precisely. And that is the exact vulnerability Cleopatra recognized and exploited. She looked at a 300-year-old tradition of linguistic isolation, and she just dismantled it. She dedicated herself to mastering the Egyptian language.
The source text calls this decision a masterstroke of public relations, and when you look at the mechanics of it, it is just brilliant.
It really is.
By speaking Egyptian, she instantly eliminated that entire bureaucratic filter. She could speak directly to the powerful Egyptian priesthoods in Memphis. She could communicate with the local magistrates without some translator subtly altering her words to fit their own agendas.
And consider the psychological impact on the native populace. For 10 generations, the people of Egypt had been ruled by monarchs who literally could not hear their voices.
Yeah.
Then, this young queen emerges who speaks their tongue. She participates in their religious festivals, not as a foreign observer, but as an active, fluent participant. She assumes the traditional pharaonic titles with actual cultural authenticity.
It totally bypasses the Greek elite.
Completely. It anchors her legitimacy directly into the bedrock of the native population.
It is the ultimate defense mechanism against her own family. If her ambitious brother or a disgruntled Greek general wants to stage a coup against her, it becomes infinitely more difficult if millions of everyday Egyptians view her not just as a Ptolemy, but as the first true Egyptian queen in centuries. She basically used linguistics to build an invisible fortress of public loyalty around herself.
And it highlights a core theme in the source material for you to think about. Language is not merely a tool for communication. It is a mechanism of power. And the text note, she didn't stop at Egyptian.
Right, she learned so many more.
She learned Ethiopian, Trogodyte, Hebrew, Arabic, Syrian, Median, and Parthian.
That is insane.
She was building a diplomatic arsenal that allowed her to negotiate complex trade and military agreements across the entire Eastern Mediterranean, all without relying on interpreters.
That level of intellectual preparation is astonishing, but, no amount of internal public relations or linguistic brilliance could stop the external threat that was fundamentally reshaping the ancient world at that time.
No, the geopolitical tidal wave was already moving.
Right. Let's look at the macro geopolitical chessboard. Egypt is sitting on unimaginable wealth. It is the agricultural powerhouse of the Mediterranean. But militarily, it's a shadow of its former self. And across the sea, you have Rome.
And Rome, in this era, was a burgeoning, aggressive, heavily militarized republic. They were expanding their borders relentlessly.
Which is expensive.
Incredibly expensive. It required massive sustained capital. They needed grain to feed their bloated metropolis to prevent civil unrest, and they needed gold to pay their vast legions. Egypt was essentially the only nation that possessed a massive surplus of both.
I always think of ancient Egypt as the Federal Reserve in antiquity. Because the Nile flooded with absolute predictability, their agricultural yield was essentially a mathematical certainty. They controlled the economic stability of the entire region. So Rome looked at Egypt not just as a rival, but as a giant, unguarded bank vault.
And Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, he recognized this existential threat. But his strategy to keep Rome at bay was essentially financial appeasement.
Which never works.
No. He took out astronomical loans from Roman creditors to pay massive bribes to Roman politicians, just hoping to buy their protection and recognition of his legitimacy.
It is such a terrible strategy. It's the geopolitical equivalent of bleeding yourself dry to feed a shark, hoping the shark eventually gets full.
Right.
It doesn't earn you respect. It just signals to Rome that your economy is entirely subservient to their demands. So when her father dies in 51 BC, the situation is an absolute powder keg. Cleopatra inherits the throne, and she is 18 years old.
18 years old, inheriting a deeply indebted nation, facing an aggressive superpower, and structurally hindered by her father's will.
Right, the will.
Which mandated she rule jointly with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII.
And this is where we see the sheer force of her personality. A typical 18-year-old in that highly patriarchal, dangerous environment might just defer to the experienced older men in the room, right? Like the generals and the tutors managing the 10-year-old boy.
Many would have, yes.
But Cleopatra immediately and aggressively sidelined her brother. She dropped his name from official documents. She minted coins featuring only her face. She just seized the apparatus of the state.
It was a necessary assertion of power for her, but it triggered an immediate fierce counter-reaction. The powerful advisors surrounding the young boymen, like Pothinus, the influential court eunuch, and Achilles, the military commander, they realized that under Cleopatra, their influence would be completely marginalized.
So they launch a coup, and they do it using a really sophisticated smear campaign. Because they couldn't just assassinate her openly due to that public loyalty she had cultivated, they had to systematically dismantle her political base first.
Exactly. They leveraged a famine caused by a low Nile flood to turn the populace against her, literally blaming her administration for the lack of grain. They accused her of plotting against her brother. By systematically isolating her from the military and weaponizing public unrest, they forced her out of the capital.
So by the time she is 21, the most educated, strategically brilliant woman in the Mediterranean has been ousted. She is forced into exile in the harsh deserts of Syria. She has lost the throne, she's lost the library, she's lost everything.
And many monarchs would have faded into history at that point, accepting exile or just waiting for an assassin's blade. But Cleopatra utilized the wealth she had managed to smuggle out and her extensive diplomatic networks to begin raising a mercenary army.
She was not giving up.
Not at all. She was preparing to march back across the desert and retake Egypt by force. But then the entire strategic landscape of the world shifted overnight.
Because Julius Caesar arrives in Egypt. And he doesn't arrive on a friendly diplomatic tour. He arrives in the wake of a massive, bloody Roman civil war.
Right. Caesar had just decisively defeated his primary Roman rival, Pompey the Great, at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey, desperate and fleeing, sailed to Egypt seeking sanctuary. He believed the Ptolemaic advisors would harbor him because of past alliances with Cleopatra's father.
And here we witness what is basically a catastrophic failure of geopolitical calculus by the advisors who ousted Cleopatra. Pothinus and Achilles look at Pompey arriving, and they make a brutally pragmatic but ultimately fatal decision.
Yeah, they calculate that if they harbor Pompey, Caesar will inevitably invade Egypt. But if they turn Pompey away, Pompey will survive and become their enemy.
So they choose option 3. They murder Pompey the moment he steps off his boat, and they present his severed head to Julius Caesar when he arrives, completely expecting Caesar to be thrilled that they solved his problem for him.
It was a fundamental misreading of Roman psychology and the deeply ingrained concept of dignitas.
Right.
Pompey was Caesar's rival, yes, but he was also a revered Roman consul, a legendary general, and formerly Caesar's own son-in-law. To have a towering figure of the Roman Republic unceremoniously butchered by foreign advisors was viewed by Caesar as a profound insult to Rome itself.
So instead of gratitude, Caesar reacted with absolute disgust.
Total disgust.
He essentially confiscates the royal palace in Alexandria. He occupies it with his elite legions and declares that, as the representative of Rome, who is the primary creditor to the Egyptian state, he is going to adjudicate the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother.
And Cleopatra, out in the Syrian desert, receives this intelligence, and she recognizes a fleeting, singular window of opportunity. The most powerful man on earth is currently sitting in her palace, deeply alienated by the very men who stole her throne.
It's the perfect setup.
If she could reach him before her brother's advisors poison his mind against her, she can flip the entire board.
But the physical mechanics of actually doing that are nearly impossible. The city of Alexandria, the harbor, the streets leading to the palace, they are all entirely controlled by her brother's heavily armed military. If she rides up with her mercenary army, it's open warfare. If she tries to sneak in wearing a disguise and is recognized, she will be executed in an alleyway before Caesar ever even knows she is in the city.
Which necessitates the infiltration we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive.
The laundry sack.
Yes. She utilized a trusted servant, a Sicilian named Apollodorus. Under the cover of darkness, she boarded a small skiff, slipped past the harbor blockades, and landed near the palace. To bypass the palace guards, she was wrapped in what historical sources describe as a bed sack or a rolled carpet, tied up with a cord.
The psychological endurance required for that is just staggering. You are trusting your life entirely to a servant carrying you like a piece of luggage. You are bound, blind, and helpless.
And when Apollodorus finally reached Caesar's private quarters and untied the sack, the visual impact alone would have been extraordinary. But the true leverage wasn't the theatrical entrance. It was what happened the moment she stood up.
Right. If she just pops out and looks frightened, Caesar likely just calls his guards and hands her over to her brother to secure a quick peace treaty.
Exactly. Instead, she immediately engaged him in high-level geopolitical negotiation. She didn't plead for her life. She argued for her throne. She utilized her fluency in Greek, her deep understanding of Roman economic needs, and her sharp intellect to prove to Caesar that she was a highly capable, rational partner. Caesar famously valued audacity, intellect, and courage above all else. He was profoundly impressed.
And this forces us to really reevaluate that entire seductress narrative we talked about. Like, was this legendary alliance based on a genuine affair of the heart, or was it a cold, calculated transaction? The historical record suggests that demanding it be strictly one or the other just oversimplifies human nature.
I agree. It was likely the convergence of supreme strategic alignment and intense personal magnetism. Caesar was a 52-year-old pragmatist deeply entrenched in Roman politics. He desperately needed the immense agricultural wealth of Egypt to fund his continuing political dominance back in Rome.
And he needed stability.
Right. He needed a stable, compliant ruler on the Egyptian throne, not a cabal of unpredictable advisors who had just murdered a Roman consul.
And Cleopatra, at 21, needed the unmatched military force of the Roman legions to destroy her brother's army and permanently secure her reign. They possessed exactly what the other required for survival.
However, forging that alliance carried an immediate, devastating cost. When Caesar formally announced his support for Cleopatra, her brother's advisors didn't just surrender.
Oh no, they escalated.
They mobilized the entire Alexandrian army, which was over 20,000 well-trained soldiers, and laid siege to the royal palace complex.
The Siege of Alexandria. And this wasn't just some minor skirmish. Caesar and Cleopatra were trapped inside the palace precinct with a fraction of that number of troops. It devolved into months of brutal, grinding urban warfare, right in the narrow streets of the city.
The tactical situation was incredibly dire. At one point, to prevent the Egyptian fleet from falling into enemy hands and blocking his reinforcements, Caesar was forced to order the fleet burned at the docks.
And the fire didn't stop at the water. The flames spread from the docks into the city, engulfing warehouses. And this is where history records a catastrophic cultural tragedy. The fire likely spread to structures associated with the Great Library,
Yes.
the immense repository of human knowledge. The very institution that had shaped Cleopatra's intellect was literally caught in the crossfire of this desperate survival tactic.
It perfectly highlights the horrific collateral damage of ancient geopolitical conflict. But despite the losses, Caesar's discipline and defensive tactics held out long enough for Roman reinforcements to finally arrive from Asia Minor. They broke the siege.
And then the tide turns.
In the ensuing Battle of the Nile, the Ptolemaic forces were completely routed. The 10-year-old king, Ptolemy XIII, drowned in the river, weighed down by his golden armor while attempting to flee.
And the advisors were executed. The opposition was entirely liquidated. Cleopatra was completely reinstated, but now her power was guaranteed by Roman steel. And to anchor this alliance biologically and politically, she gave birth to Caesar's son Caesarion.
And the birth of Caesarion, or Little Caesar, was a monumental political statement. He was the living, breathing union of the Roman Republic and the Ptolemaic Empire. With her throne secure, Cleopatra made a move that shattered every diplomatic convention of the era.
She travels to Rome.
She traveled to Rome itself.
And she didn't just visit quietly as a guest. She moved into Caesar's massive estate across the Tiber River. She held court, receiving Roman senators and diplomats as an absolute monarch, residing in the heart of a republic that possessed a deep institutional hatred for kings and queens.
The Roman cultural revulsion cannot be overstated here. Rome defined itself by the overthrow of its ancient kings. For Julius Caesar, their leading citizen, to openly live with a foreign Eastern queen and acknowledge their illegitimate son, it was viewed as a direct assault on Roman tradition and morality.
It must have been scandalous.
It fueled the paranoia that Caesar intended to dissolve the republic entirely and move the capital of the new empire to Alexandria.
And that paranoia is the exact mechanism that led to the Ides of March in 44 BC. Caesar is brutally assassinated on the floor of the Senate by his own peers. And in an instant, the entire architecture of Cleopatra's security collapses.
The assassination plunged Rome back into a massive civil war and left Cleopatra incredibly vulnerable. She had tied the fate of her nation to the survival of one man. With Caesar dead, she was surrounded by hostile Roman factions.
So what does she do?
She immediately fled the city, navigating the chaotic Mediterranean back to the safety of Egypt to fortify her kingdom and protect her young son.
The geopolitical board is entirely wiped clean at this point. The ensuing Roman civil war results in the assassins being defeated by Caesar's loyalists. The victors then carve up the Roman world to prevent further conflict. Caesar's young, fiercely intelligent adopted heir, Octavian, takes control of the western provinces, including Rome.
Right.
Meanwhile, Caesar's most experienced, charismatic general, Mark Antony, takes command of the wealthy, sprawling eastern provinces.
But Antony's strategic position was precarious. He was planning a massive military campaign against the Parthian Empire to the east, a campaign intended to basically eclipse Caesar's glory. But mobilizing an army of that scale required astronomical funding.
He found himself facing the exact same economic reality Caesar had faced.
Exactly. He needed the wealth of Egypt. So Antony summons Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus.
And Cleopatra, having learned from her past, she recognizes that simply showing up to negotiate a treaty would position her as a subservient vassal state answering a summons. She needed to establish dominance before a single word was spoken.
She needed to orchestrate a sensory and psychological assault tailored specifically to Mark Antony's personality.
This is where her psychological profiling is just absolutely unmatched. She knew Antony wasn't the cold, calculating intellectual that Caesar was. Antony was a man of massive appetites. He loved spectacle, he loved theater, and he strongly associated himself with Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, revelry, and grand conquests.
And understanding that psychological framework, she did not arrive in a standard diplomatic galley. She constructed a floating palace. The historical accounts of the Barge of Venus describe an overwhelming display of wealth and divine iconography.
The physical details are insane to read about. The sails were dyed with Tyrian purple. Now, if you look at the economics of the ancient world, extracting that purple dye from sea snails was so labor-intensive that purple fabric was literally worth its weight in silver or gold.
Oh, it was the ultimate status symbol.
Having massive ship sails made of it was a flex of unimaginable wealth. The oars were coated in silver, striking the water in time to live music. The smell of burning exotic incense wafted down the river before the boat was even visible to the people on the shore.
And Cleopatra herself was positioned beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed explicitly in the iconography of the goddess Venus, while boys dressed as cupids fanned her. She was communicating through pure visual spectacle. She was saying, you may be a powerful general of Rome, but I am a living goddess and I command the wealth of empires.
It completely short-circuited Antony's defenses. He was enthralled. The psychological manipulation evolved rapidly into a powerful personal and political alliance. But it's crucial to note, this wasn't just a party. She secured deep concessions from him. She had him eliminate her remaining political rivals in exile, completely securing her borders.
Yes, over the next decade, they forged a powerful dual empire, eventually having 3 children together. However, this alliance contained a fatal political flaw.
A huge one.
To secure his initial truce with Octavian back in Rome, Antony had married Octavian's sister, Octavia, a deeply respected, traditional Roman noblewoman.
And as Antony became more entwined with Cleopatra, relocating entirely to Alexandria and living as an Eastern monarch, he effectively abandoned Octavia. He publicly humiliated her, and by extension, humiliated Octavia.
And in Roman politics, insulting the familial honor of a rival is incredibly dangerous. Handing that rival a narrative that you have abandoned your Roman duty for a foreign queen is political suicide. Octavian was arguably the greatest political strategist of his age. He wasn't the military commander Antony was, but he understood the sheer destructive power of propaganda.
Octavian launches a masterclass in ancient character assassination. He didn't frame the coming war as a political dispute between 2 Roman leaders over territory. That would divide the Roman populace. He had to unify them.
He achieved that by entirely removing Antony's agency in the public narrative. Octavian's propaganda painted Antony not as a traitor, but as a tragic victim, a noble Roman general who had been literally bewitched by a decadent, dangerous foreign sorceress.
It's brilliant, insidious framing. It turns a messy civil war into a holy crusade. Octavian is basically saying, we aren't fighting our old war hero Antony. We're going to war to rescue him from the toxic, corrupting influence of the East. He weaponized Roman xenophobia and misogyny to secure the funding and the mandate to declare war on Egypt.
The propaganda reached a fever pitch when Octavian illegally seized Antony's will from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins in Rome and read it to the Senate. Whether the document was entirely genuine or partially forged by Octavian, it claimed that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, not in Rome.
That was the final straw.
It was the incontrovertible proof that Antony had ceased to be Roman. The Senate declared war, explicitly targeting Cleopatra.
And this inexorable march to war culminates in 31 BC at the Battle of Actium. This is the decisive clash. The massive fleets of Octavian, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, face off against the combined heavy fleets of Antony and Cleopatra off the western coast of Greece.
The mechanics of this battle are crucial to understanding the final unraveling of their empire. Antony and Cleopatra possessed massive, heavily armored warships called quinqueremes. Octavian's fleet utilized smaller, highly maneuverable ships called Liburnians. But before the battle even began, Agrippa had systematically cut off Antony's supply lines.
Antony's camp was trapped. They were suffering from severe outbreaks of malaria and dysentery. Their sailors were dying before the ships even hit the water.
Realizing a prolonged land campaign was doomed, Antony and Cleopatra opted for a massive naval breakout. The objective wasn't necessarily to destroy Octavian's fleet, but to punch a hole through his lines so they could escape back to Egypt with the war chest and the core of their army, just to fight another day.
So the battle begins, and it is sheer chaos. Massive ships ramming into each other, the sea choked with smoke, debris, and thousands of men fighting. And right in the middle of this horrific clash, history records one of its most debated mysteries. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships, carrying the Egyptian treasury, suddenly hoists their sails, breaks through a gap in the fighting, and flees the battle entirely.
The Roman propagandists obviously framed this as the ultimate act of feminine cowardice, the cowardly queen abandoning her lover in his darkest hour. But analyzing her entire life's trajectory, panic fundamentally contradicts her established psychological profile.
Hold on, if it wasn't panic, how do we explain her leaving the most important battle of her life?
We must look at the naval reality. The battle was already turning against them. The heavy ships were sluggish and being swarmed. As a geopolitical strategist, Cleopatra likely recognized that the engagement was lost.
She did the math.
Exactly. If her squadron carrying the wealth of Egypt was captured, the war was permanently over. By executing a calculated, desperate retreat, she was attempting to preserve the state apparatus. She was saving the capital needed to raise another army in Alexandria.
But the calculation completely imploded because of Antony's reaction. When Antony saw her royal flagship speeding away, he didn't rally his remaining forces to cover her retreat. He abandoned his flagship, boarded a smaller vessel, and chased after her.
And the psychological impact on his fleet was instantaneous and catastrophic. Imagine being a Roman legionary or sailor, bleeding on a burning deck, fighting for a commander who just hopped on a fast boat and abandoned you.
Yeah, the morale completely collapsed.
The fleet surrendered. And shortly after, his massive land army, realizing they had been abandoned as well, negotiated a surrender to Octavian.
Actium was the fatal blow. They managed to sail back to Egypt, but they were a queen and a general without an army. Octavian's forces systematically moved in, completely unopposed. By 30 BC, Octavian's legions are at the gates of Alexandria.
The final sequence of events is a tragedy of errors and despair. Antony, attempting a final, futile defense of the city, receives a false report. He's told that Cleopatra, realizing the city had fallen, had retreated to her mausoleum and taken her own life.
And for Antony, a man whose entire identity was built on conquest and grandeur, the realization that he had lost his army, his honor, and now his queen was just too much. He commits suicide by falling on his sword.
But the wound is not immediately fatal. In his final hours, he discovers she is actually still alive, barricaded inside the massive stone mausoleum she had constructed. He is hoisted up through a window into the monument, and he dies in her arms.
Cleopatra is now entirely alone. The wealth is gone, the military is gone, her partner is dead. She is formally taken captive by Octavian's forces, and she knows exactly the fate that Octavian has meticulously planned for her.
Octavian's objective was not merely to execute her. He required a public, highly visible demonstration of his absolute supremacy. He intended to transport her back to Rome, place her in heavy golden chains, and force her to walk through the streets of the capital in his formal Roman triumph.
Let's break down the mechanics of a Roman triumph for you, because it explains her final action. It wasn't just a parade, it was a deeply religious, brutally humiliating ritual. Captured enemy monarchs were paraded behind the victorious general's chariot and during the jeers and filth thrown by the Roman mob.
Yes.
And at the culmination of the parade, when the chariot reached the Temple of Jupiter, the captive monarch was taken to an underground cell and strangled to death.
For a woman who had ruled as a living goddess, who had negotiated the fate of empires with Julius Caesar, to be reduced to a broken, chained prop in Octavian's political theater was an indignity she fundamentally refused to accept. She retained total clarity of mind regarding narrative control. She realized that the only move left on the board was to dictate the terms of her own exit.
She chooses August 12th, 30 BC. She is 39 years old. The traditional, highly romanticized narrative is that she had a venomous snake, an asp, smuggled into her heavily guarded chambers hidden inside a basket of figs, allowing it to bite her.
Although historians and toxicologists frequently challenge the logistics of the snake narrative, an asp bite is agonizing, unreliable, and often physically disfiguring. It is highly probable that she utilized a lethal, fast-acting mixture of poisons, perhaps hemlock or wolfsbane, that she had kept concealed, perhaps in a hollow hairpin.
But really, the specific chemical mechanism of her death is less important than the strategic outcome of the act itself.
Exactly. By ending her own life before she could be transported, she dealt Octavian a final, permanent defeat. She robbed him of the centerpiece of his triumph. He could parade an effigy of her, but he could never parade the queen herself. In an environment of total, absolute geopolitical failure, she managed to orchestrate a final victory of personal autonomy and narrative preservation.
And with her last breath, the 300-year reign of the Ptolemaic dynasty ends. Egypt ceases to be an independent, dominant empire and is absorbed as a personal province of Octavian, who would soon rename himself Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The world order fundamentally, irreversibly shifts.
When we synthesize all the source material, we really answer the question of why her legacy has endured with such intensity. It is not because she was a tragic romantic figure. It is because she was an intellectual titan operating in an era of terrifying geopolitical instability. She maximized every resource available to her: the agricultural wealth of the Nile, her mastery of linguistics, her profound understanding of human psychology, and the cultural gravity of Alexandria.
She proves that real power isn't just about fielding the largest army. Power is understanding the precise pressure points of your enemies. Power is mastering the language of the people you govern. I mean, we see modern political campaigns and corporate empires spending billions to attempt the kind of public relations mastery and brand loyalty that she engineered 2,000 years ago.
She provides a timeless blueprint for resilience. Think about it. She was exiled, besieged, smeared by global propaganda, and faced down the greatest military machine in human history, armed largely with her own intellect. She fought an extraordinary war of survival against impossible odds. Here's something for you to mull over. What if Cleopatra's greatest legacy isn't the empire she lost, but the very blueprint she created for using cultural diplomacy, linguistic connection, and personal branding in statecraft? It's a blueprint we still see world leaders attempting to master today.
That is such a fascinating thought to leave on. Consider the funhouse mirror of history. The men who defeated her spent centuries trying to reduce her to a caricature because the reality of her brilliance was just too intimidating to acknowledge. Thank you for joining us today for this deep dive. Keep pulling at the threads of these historical narratives, look for the underlying mechanisms of power, and always question the stories told by the victors.
Think about the last time you were in, like, a really bad screaming match.
Those are the worst.
Right. Your heart is just pounding against your ribs. Your palms are sweating. Your breathing gets all shallow.
You're basically in full fight or flight mode.
Exactly. And you realize halfway through all this that you aren't even arguing about the dishes anymore or the missed deadline. You're arguing to survive.
Yeah, your brain just completely shifts gears.
It really does. And in that exact moment, the words coming out of your mouth are, well, they're no longer carefully chosen. They are just whatever ammunition your panic brain can grab.
Which is usually not great ammunition.
No, it's terrible. We have all been there, and it is a deeply, deeply uncomfortable place to be.
It really is. It's the moment where communication just completely breaks down and sheer neurobiology takes over.
Right.
Because the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain responsible for logic, reason, careful language, it basically gets hijacked by the amygdala.
The amygdala hijack. I've heard of that.
Exactly. So you aren't actually having a conversation anymore. You are experiencing a mutual threat response.
Wow. Okay, well, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are jumping straight into the deep end today because we are tackling a subject that literally every single person listening to this has wrestled with.
Oh, absolutely. And probably lost sleep over, honestly.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
We're talking about the art of the difficult conversation, and we are cracking open a really fascinating behavioral blueprint today.
Yes, it's actually an advanced C2 level English learning curriculum.
Which sounds kind of dry at first, right?
It does, but it's not just a vocabulary list. Not at all.
No, it's this highly targeted exploration of the exact linguistic and psychological tactics used in uncomfortable, high-stakes conversations.
Right. And what makes this specific framework so uniquely valuable is that it approaches conflict not as this mysterious emotional weather system that you just have to suffer through.
Right, like a hurricane you just have to hide from.
Exactly. Instead, it treats it as a measurable, manageable exchange of power dynamics. It breaks down the cognitive linguistics of conflict.
Which is just a fancy way of saying it. It explains the underlying mechanics of why certain words trigger us.
Yes. Why certain grammatical structures cause instant defensiveness, and why other specific, highly calculated strategies work to practically short-circuit that threat response.
Okay, let's unpack this, because everyone dreads conflict. But what if shifting just a few specific words, or even just the volume of your voice, could completely alter the outcome of an argument?
It sounds like a superpower, honestly.
It really does. So the mission of this deep dive is to equip you with specific, actionable phrases and behavioral strategies to navigate these moments.
Whether you are prepping for a tense workplace negotiation or, dealing with a partner about household chores.
Or even just trying to manage a really difficult chat with a neighbor. We want to show you how to keep your cool. So let's start right where so many of these conversations hit their absolute first, incredibly frustrating roadblock.
The dreaded dead end.
Yes. You've gathered your courage, right? You've initiated the talk, you've presented your perspective, and the other person just shut down.
Complete system failure.
Exactly. The curriculum refers to this defense mechanism as the wall.
Also known clinically as stonewalling. And it is a profound, incredibly potent defense mechanism.
It's so frustrating to deal with.
It is, because when someone stonewalls, they don't just go quiet. They entirely withdraw from the interaction.
Right.
They refuse to communicate. Their body language physically closes on, so you'll see crossed arms. They might turn away from you.
Yeah, they might literally just stare at their shoes.
Exactly. It is the conversational equivalent of a turtle pulling its head into its shell.
And it is completely infuriating when you're on the other side of it. Because you are standing there, your adrenaline is already pumping because, you had to work yourself up to even start this difficult conversation.
Right, you're all geared up.
Yes. You are ready to engage, and suddenly you are talking to a brick wall. And the natural instinct, and I am incredibly guilty of this, is to keep talking.
Oh, most people are. It's human nature.
It really is. If there is dead air, I feel this overwhelming need to fill it with my own anxiety. I will re-explain my point. I'll ask if they heard me. I might even get a little aggressive and demand that they say something.
Which is exactly what the curriculum issues a massive warning about. It states that the absolute worst thing you can possibly do in this moment is to keep pushing.
Really? The worst thing?
The absolute worst. If we look at the psychology, the cognitive reality of what is happening when you face the wall, it makes perfect sense why we do this, though.
Because we hate the silence.
Exactly. When the other person goes silent, your brain interprets that sudden lack of social feedback as an escalating threat.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, humans are social primates, right?
Good.
So silence in the middle of a conflict signals danger. Your anxiety spikes. You feel this acute loss of control over the situation.
And so to regain that control, your instinct is just to flood the zone.
Precisely. You over-explain, you rephrase, you badger them. But all that does is validate their initial decision to hide in their shell.
Because you look crazy.
Kind of, yeah. Your growing, visible agitation proves to their nervous system that the environment is fundamentally unsafe.
Wow.
Which only locks the wall more firmly in place.
Okay, so I was thinking about this when reading the source, and it's like overwatering a potted plant.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. Like if you have a house plant and the soil is bone dry and you pour a massive cup of water into it, the water doesn't absorb right away, it just pools on the surface.
Right, it just sits there.
Yeah, and if you panic and think, oh, it needs more, and you keep pouring, it doesn't help the plant. It just overflows, makes a huge mess, and ruins your hardwood floor.
Exactly. You have to stop pouring.
You have to step back and just let the soil slowly absorb what you've already given it, right? If you keep talking to someone who is stonewalling, you are drowning them in words they physically lack the capacity to absorb in that moment.
That is a perfect way to put it. And if you keep pouring words into that saturated soil, it causes runoff. In a difficult conversation, that runoff manifests as defensive anger.
Oh, right, because they get overwhelmed.
Yes, the cognitive load you've placed on them with the initial confrontation has just saturated their processing abilities. So the curriculum suggests a completely counterintuitive alternative.
Which is what?
Intentionally using silence.
Just staying quiet.
Just staying quiet. You have to endure the agonizing discomfort of the quiet. You have to give them the physical and temporal space to process.
But wait, isn't intentional silence incredibly awkward? I mean, how do you physically stop yourself from rambling when the silence stretches on for like 10 seconds?
It is incredibly awkward. You literally just have to bite your tongue. You have to recognize that the awkwardness is your own anxiety, not a sign that the conversation is failing.
I want to ask you, the listener, to just reflect on your own instinct for a second. Do you talk more when you get nervous in an argument? Do you try to fill the silence? Because I know I do.
It's a very common habit to break. But if that intentional silence stretches on and absolutely fails to produce a response like, they're just not talking to Bizant, the framework provides a highly specific linguistic pivot.
Okay, what's the pivot?
It is a gentle, strategically open-ended question. The exact phrasing in the curriculum is, I notice you've gone quiet. I want to make sure I'm understanding your side. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, wow. Let's really look at the mechanics of that phrasing, because it's very deliberate. I notice you've gone quiet. It's an empirical observation.
Exactly. It's not an accusation.
Right. You aren't saying, why are you ignoring me? Which immediately assigns malicious intent and puts them on the defensive.
This is where the C2 level linguistic precision really shines. By using the phrase, I notice, you are employing what linguists call epistemic modality.
Epistemic modality. Okay, what does that actually mean?
It means you are framing the statement not as an absolute objective fact of the universe that they must defend against, but simply as your subjective perception in that moment.
Okay. That makes sense. It inherently lowers the threat level.
It does. And furthermore, saying gone quiet instead of stop talking frames their silence as a state of being rather than a deliberate hostile action taken against you.
That is such a subtle shift, but so powerful. And then the follow-up. I want to make sure I'm understanding your side. You are actively taking the burden of the communication failure onto yourself.
Precisely. You are suggesting I am failing to understand rather than you are failing to explain.
It relies on that classic idiom, right? Putting the ball in their court.
Yes. You've gently lofted the tennis ball over the net, and now the responsibility of the game is entirely on them, but without a hint of aggression.
You are inviting them back into the dialogue on their own terms. It's brilliant.
It's a masterclass in shifting responsibility, but we have to admit, relying solely on silence and gentle observation assumes the other person is eventually going to speak in good faith.
Right. And they don't always do that.
No, they do not. We have to address the reality of what happens when they do speak, but they weaponize their words to distract you.
Okay, so this brings us to the next big section of the source material. Because if the wall is the defense mechanism of complete silence, the exact opposite defense mechanism is verbal deflection.
Yes, which requires a completely different linguistic tool to handle.
Totally. It's a relentless flood of words meant to disorient you. You are trying to have a focused, serious conversation about a specific issue, and the other person constantly tries to steer the car off the road.
Right. They flood the discussion with excuses.
Exactly. Excuses, whataboutisms, totally unrelated historical grievances from, like, 3 years ago.
It is a classic diversionary tactic. Consciously or subconsciously, their brain recognizes they are in a vulnerable or losing position regarding the core issue.
So they change the subject.
Exactly. They attempt to change the battlefield. They want to move the conversation to a topic where they feel they have the upper hand, or at least where the blame is more evenly distributed.
So how do we handle someone who constantly tries to steer the conversation away from the actual topic?
The blueprint introduces a concept called the broken record strategy.
The broken record. I like the sound of that. What is the core instruction there?
The core instruction is to calmly and firmly repeat your main point without getting angry, no matter what new distracting information the other person throws at you.
Okay, let's dive deep into the specific real-world example from the source, because I think it perfectly illustrates this.
Yes, the neighbor example.
Right. Imagine you have a neighbor.
Yeah.
And their dog keeps getting into your yard and completely ruining your flower garden.
A very relatable problem.
Very. So you finally approach the neighbor to ask them to keep the dog contained. But instead of addressing the issue of the dog, the neighbor immediately deploys a smokescreen of sympathy.
Right. They start deflecting.
Yeah, they start talking about how stressed they are at work, how they're dealing with a family crisis, how they haven't slept in days.
They're essentially daring you to be the bad guy who ignores their suffering.
Exactly. And the prescribed response from the curriculum here requires immense linguistic discipline. What are you supposed to say?
The curriculum suggests looking at them and saying, I understand you're busy, but I need you to keep the dog out of my flower beds.
Wow. Okay, let's break down the architecture of that specific sentence, because there is so much happening beneath the surface there.
There really is. It operates in two very distinct halves.
Right. The first half is, I understand you're busy. You are actively validating their excuse.
Yes. You are acknowledging their reality, which prevents them from using the ultimate deflection, which is, you aren't even listening to me.
Oh, that's such a common one.
Right. By saying, I understand, you prove that you are listening. But the critical hinge of the entire strategy is the word but.
The word but. Why is that so important?
Because in cognitive linguistics, the word but functions as a conversational eraser.
An eraser.
Yeah. If you say, you did a great job on this report, but the listener's brain immediately discards the praise and braces for the criticism.
Oh, that is so true. I totally do that.
Right. Usually in communication training, we are taught to avoid but. We're taught to use and instead to validate both realities, like, I understand you are busy and I need you to keep the dog out.
Right, the yes and approach.
Exactly. However, in the specific high-stakes context of deflection, the curriculum deliberately prescribes but.
Interesting. Why?
Because you want to erase their excuse as a valid derailing tactic.
No.
You concede their premise, yes, you are busy, but you categorically refuse to accept it as a reason to abandon the boundary.
The boundary being the second half of the sentence. But I need you to keep the dog out of my flower beds?
Precisely. And this leads to the golden rule the source highlights for this technique. Consistency over volume.
Consistency over volume. I absolutely cannot stop thinking about that phrase. It's brilliant.
It is the absolute engine of the strategy. It strips the power away from their excuses.
Because when they throw out the next deflection, let's say they pivot from being a victim to being an accuser, right? And they say, well, your cat comes into my yard and leaves a mess on my patio.
Which is a classic move.
Right. Your natural instinct is to defend your cat. You want to argue the facts. My cat is an indoor cat, or whatever.
But the moment you start talking about your cat, they have won. They have successfully changed the battlefield.
Wow. So consistency over volume dictates that you do not take the bait.
Exactly. You use the exact same syntactic structure again. You say, I hear your frustration about the cat, but right now I need you to keep the dog out of my flower bed.
You just refuse to engage with the new topics they introduce? You calmly return to the core issue.
Yes, you strip the oxygen away from their deflections.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me, though. And I have to ask a critical question here.
Go for it.
Is there a severe risk of sounding condescending? Or like a literal robot, if you just keep repeating the same sentence structure over and over again?
It's a very valid concern.
Right. Like, if I'm the neighbor and you just keep doing that, I'm going to get mad.
Yeah.
How do we balance this rigid consistency with natural human conversation?
It comes down to a critical distinction between delivery and content.
Okay, explain that.
The words themselves are the content, and yes, they are intentionally rigid. They are the boundary line. But the delivery, your tone, your facial expression, your body language must remain warm, or at the very least entirely neutral. The moment you introduce a heavy sigh, a subtle eye roll, or a sharp, sarcastic edge to that broken record sentence, you've crossed the line from setting a healthy boundary to initiating aggression.
Right, if you sound annoyed, it defeats the purpose.
Completely. The empathy lives entirely in that first concessionary clause. I understand you are deeply stressed right now, and it has to be authentic.
You can't just fake it.
No, you cannot just parrot the words while secretly seething with rage. If you do, humans are incredibly adept at detecting micro-expressions of contempt. They will hear the condescension, and the conflict will just escalate further.
Which brings us to a huge glaring issue. Because to successfully pull off the broken record technique without sounding aggressive, you have to maintain absolute physical and emotional control.
You do. It requires immense emotional intelligence in real time.
But as we established at the very beginning of this deep dive, in a difficult conversation, your heart is beating out of your chest. You are just marinating in adrenaline.
Yes, the fight or flight response.
Right. So how on earth do you maintain that level of precise emotional and physical control?
This is where the curriculum gets into the physiology of conflict, because all the linguistic tricks in the world fall apart if you cannot manage your own biology.
Okay, let's get into section 3 then. The physiological markers of a lost argument. Because the framework makes a definitive, biologically grounded claim here.
Yes, it states that if your heart rate rises significantly, or if the physical volume of your voice increases, the conversation is already lost.
Already lost, like before the argument is even over.
Yes, because if we connect this to the bigger picture, once your heart rate crosses a certain threshold, usually around 100 beats per minute, for most people in a non-exercise context, logic takes a backseat.
The sympathetic nervous system has completely taken over.
Exactly. Blood flow is literally restricted from the prefrontal cortex and redirected to your extremities to prepare for physical combat.
That is wild.
It is. You are no longer physiologically capable of nuance, empathy, or advanced linguistic structuring. You cannot execute a perfect broken record if your brain is screaming at you to fight for your survival.
Wow. So the situation is escalated, and the curriculum insists that you must become the emotional anchor.
You have to become the anchor in the room.
And the specific linguistic tactic the source reveals to establish that anchor is fascinating because it actually has nothing to do with vocabulary.
No, it is entirely acoustic.
Right. It advises intentionally lowering your volume.
Yes. Lowering your volume.
Which is the exact opposite of what we normally do. When the other person starts getting loud, our mirror neurons, our competitive instincts, they tell us to match their volume so we can be heard over the noise.
But the curriculum says you must do the exact opposite. Drop your voice, speak softer, slower.
And why does that work?
Because if you drop your voice, you change the physics of the interaction. You force the other person to physically quiet down just to be able to hear what you are saying.
It's like a psychological judo move.
It really is. It manipulates the acoustic environment. When you speak very softly, the other person has to subconsciously lean in. They have to stop shouting in order to concentrate on your auditory signal.
So this subtle move completely shifts the power dynamic.
Exactly. It transitions from a chaotic shouting match where dominance is determined by decibel level to a controlled, manageable discussion where you dictate the terms of engagement.
You're controlling the environment, not just your words.
Precisely. You control the acoustic environment, which in turn controls their biological response.
So what does this all mean in practice? I have an analogy for this.
Let's hear it.
It makes me think about what we all do when we are driving in an unfamiliar city.
Oh, I think I know where you're going with this.
Right. You are looking for a specific, poorly lit street sign. You think you missed your turn, you are getting stressed, and what is the very first thing you do?
You reach over and turn down the car radio.
Yes, you turn down the radio. It makes absolutely no logical sense. The music playing inside the car has zero impact on your eye's ability to see a metal sign through a glass windshield.
But we all do it instinctively.
We do. We turn down the volume because we are trying to lower the sensory stimulus in our environment to force our brain to focus entirely on the complex problem of navigating.
That is a brilliant analogy.
When you intentionally lower your voice in the middle of a heated argument, it's exactly like turning down the car radio. You are turning down the radio for both of you.
Yes, you are reducing the chaotic sensory input of the shouting so that both of your brains can switch gears and actually process the immediate problem of the conflict.
It acts as a pattern interrupt.
Exactly. By forcing their auditory cortex to strain slightly to hear your lowered voice, you are literally forcing their prefrontal cortex to reboot and come back online.
That is just incredible. Okay, so let's fast forward. Let's say you've done it.
You've navigated the gauntlet.
Yes. You sat through the agonizing, awkward silence of the wall without over-explaining.
Check.
You employed the broken record to slice through the neighbor's deflections.
Check.
You consciously lowered your volume, acting as the emotional anchor, bringing their heart rate down.
You did everything right.
And so the difficult conversation limps to an awkward but ultimately resolved conclusion. You've agreed the dog will stay out of the garden.
Yeah.
You take a deep breath, you shake hands, you walk away.
It's over. You survived.
Right. But according to the source, this brings us to section 4. The curriculum makes a fascinating point here. The communication doesn't actually stop when the talking stops.
No, it does not. And this is where most people make their final fatal mistake.
Really? So you're telling me that even after we've both agreed the argument is over and the issue is resolved, I still have work to do?
Yes, you do.
Why? I mean, if the boundary is set, why do I have to keep managing their feelings? We often treat difficult conversations like a retail transaction, right?
Right, like buying something at the store.
Yeah. I pay for the goods, I take the receipt, I walk out the automatic doors, and the interaction is permanently severed.
But human relationships don't work like that.
No, they don't. The curriculum introduces a vital, non-negotiable concept that must follow any high-stakes discussion. It's the concept of aftercare.
Aftercare. It implies a medical recovery protocol, which is actually incredibly apt for this.
Because the source warns that you can't just act like a robot once the resolution is reached.
Exactly. Even if you kept your cool perfectly and achieved your desired outcome, there is a lingering, heavy cloud of awkwardness that must be actively removed.
So what does aftercare actually look like in practice?
It involves bridge building. The examples provided in the source are very tangible. It might be sending a quick text message a few hours later saying, "Hey, thanks for chatting earlier. I really value our relationship."
Or, like, if it's a workplace conflict, it might just simply be being extra friendly the next day, making a deliberate point to walk by their desk just to ask about their weekend.
Right, having a completely normal, low-stakes interaction.
But this raises an important question. Why is this necessary? If we are two professional adults and we handle the conflict professionally, why is it biologically or psychologically required to go out of my way to be warm and fuzzy?
Because of the vulnerability hangover.
The vulnerability hangover, what is that?
Well, conflict creates a massive spike in stress hormones. When you engage in a high-stakes argument, your body floods with cortisol.
Right, the stress hormone.
Exactly. And unlike adrenaline, which dissipates relatively quickly, cortisol takes hours to fully clear from your bloodstream.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So long after the conversation has ended, both of you are still physically marinating in stress hormones. The other person is likely sitting at home, ruminating,
They're replaying the conversation on a loop in their head.
driven by that cortisol, exactly. They're wondering, does my neighbor hate me now? Is my coworker going to actively try to sabotage my next project?
They're trapped in a biological anxiety loop.
Precisely. And a bridge-building gesture explicitly signals that the conflict is officially over.
Ah, I see. That simple text message or smile acts as a neurobiological reset.
Yes. It signals to their anxious brain that the conflict is contained to that specific issue and that the foundational relationship is secure. It separates the issue from the person.
You are communicating, I had a severe problem with the dog in my garden, but I do not have a problem with you as a human being.
Exactly. That aftercare is the emotional intervention that stops their rumination cycle. Without it, that leftover cortisol fuels awkwardness, which quickly festers into long-term resentment.
I really want to point out the beautiful, kind of crazy contrast here.
What's that?
Well, think about it. The broken record requires you to be rigidly firm. You have to be an unyielding wall of consistency.
Right.
But then, barely an hour later, aftercare requires you to be immediately warm, gracious, and emotionally vulnerable.
It is an incredible emotional whiplash.
It really highlights the dynamic range required to be truly good at communication. You have to possess the strength to hold the line under pressure and the absolute security to immediately soften and build a bridge.
It is the ultimate hallmark of emotional maturity, mostly because it requires the complete subjugation of your own ego.
Oh, absolutely, because
Yeah.
your ego desperately wants to hold a grudge.
Of course it does. Your ego wants to revel in the dopamine hit of winning the argument.
Yeah, it wants to force the other person to sit in their discomfort until they come crawling back to apologize.
But bridge building requires you to abandon that binary concept of winning and losing entirely.
Which brings us to the final summary of this entire deep dive. We have traveled through a really dense landscape today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We've learned to sit comfortably with the wall of silence and use neutral observation instead of over-explaining.
We learned to use the broken record to cut through excuses, using concessionary clauses and stubborn consistency.
Yes, consistency over volume. And we learned about the sheer physiological reality of the amygdala hijack and how to lower our volume to act as an emotional anchor.
And finally, we explored the critical concept of aftercare to sweep away those awkward clouds and clear the cortisol.
And all of these highly specific tactics serve one overriding core takeaway, highlighting the source's ultimate conclusion. Difficult conversations are not about winning.
No, they're not a courtroom.
Right. They are not about proving you are factually right and they are morally wrong. They are about being brave enough to be honest and reaching a mutual understanding.
And it is vital to define what mutual understanding actually means here. It doesn't mean you end up agreeing on everything.
Right.
It means you both reach a state where you fully comprehend the reality of the other person's perspective, and you collaboratively establish a path forward that acknowledges both realities.
But this leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought. A puzzle that I want you, the listener, to seriously mull over before your next inevitable conflict.
It's a tough one.
It is. We have just spent this entire deep dive outlining the perfect neurobiologically optimized way to behave.
Right.
But human beings are endlessly complex and often entirely irrational. So if the ultimate goal of all these tactics is to reach mutual understanding, what happens when you perfectly execute every single step?
You manage your physiology, you hold the silence, you use the broken record.
Yes. You do it all with perfect empathetic delivery, you offer the aftercare, and the other person still refuses to understand your side. What if they remain entirely unreasonable?
It happens all the time.
It does. Can a difficult conversation be considered a success based solely on how you behaved, even if mutual understanding is never actually reached?
That is the ultimate test of internal validation versus external results. Can you find peace in the knowledge that you held your ground with dignity, protected your boundaries, and offered grace, regardless of their inability to meet you there?
It is a profound question to explore on your own. We encourage you to pick just one of these tactics to try out the next time you find your heart rate rising. You don't have to master the whole blueprint tomorrow.
Just try lowering your volume to a whisper next time.
Or try holding that awkward silence for just 5 seconds longer than you want to. Step back into those muddy waters of human communication with a bit more intention.
At least now we understand the mechanics of how to handle ourselves.
Exactly. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.